Forget the mead-guzzling, meat-chomping barbarians you've seen in movies. The real Viking diet? It was actually way more interesting and a lot healthier than Hollywood wants you to believe. I'm talking porridge for breakfast, fermented fish that would make your eyes water, and a love affair with dairy that would put Wisconsin to shame. Today, we're diving fork first into what Vikings really ate. And spoiler alert, they were basically the original farm-to-table foodies. Let's get into it. So first things first, Vikings weren't just raiders and warriors. Most Vikings were actually farmers. We're talking 90% of the population spending their days tending crops, raising livestock, and fishing. Their entire society was built around agriculture. The Viking diet was heavily dependent on where you lived. If you were in coastal Norway, you're eating a ton of fish. Inland Sweden, you're probably eating more game and livestock. But there were some staples that almost every Viking community relied on. Grains were huge. Barley was the most common. They used it for everything, from bread to beer to porridge. Oats, rye, and some wheat too, depending on the region. Every morning, most Vikings started their day with porridge. Not the instant oatmeal we have today, but a thick, hearty gruel made from whatever grain they had on hand. Then there's dairy. Vikings loved their dairy products. We're talking milk, buttermilk, whey, cheese, skyr, which is that Icelandic yogurt that's trendy now, but Vikings were eating it 1,000 years ago. They kept cows, goats, and sheep, and they used every drop of milk these animals produced. Meat was definitely on the menu, but here's the thing. It wasn't an everyday food for most people. Livestock was valuable. A cow or pig was worth more alive, producing milk or breeding, than dead on your plate. So meat was often reserved for special occasions, feasts, or the long winter months when you'd slaughter some animals because you couldn't feed them all through winter. They ate pork, beef, mutton, goat, and game like deer, elk, and wild boar. Chickens and geese provided both eggs and meat. And if you lived near the coast or a fjord, seafood was your protein of choice. Let's talk fish, because this is where Vikings got really creative and really weird by our standards. Cod, herring, salmon, trout, if it swam in Scandinavian waters, Vikings were eating it. But here's what's fascinating. They became masters of food preservation. They had to be. No refrigeration, brutal winters, and they needed food to last months. Dried fish was everywhere. They'd hang cod on wooden racks and let the cold Arctic air freeze-dry it naturally. This created what's called stockfish, rock-hard fish that could last for years. You'd have to beat it with a hammer to break it into edible pieces and then soak it in water to rehydrate it. Not exactly gourmet, but it kept you alive. Then there's lutefisk. Now, if you've never heard of lutefisk, buckle up. Vikings would take that dried cod and soak it in lye, yes, L-Y-E, the caustic chemical, for days, until it turned into a gelatinous, somewhat translucent fish jelly. Then they'd soak it in water for more days to remove the lye. The result? A fish that has a unique texture that people either love or absolutely despise. It's still eaten in Scandinavia today during Christmas, more out of tradition than because anyone's really craving it. They also made gravlax, salmon cured with salt, sugar, and dill, buried in the ground to ferment. The word literally means buried salmon. And they fermented herring, creating surströmming, which is basically the most pungent food on Earth. People today open cans of surströmming outside because the smell is that intense. Vikings weren't afraid of funky flavors. Now you might be thinking, okay, meat, fish, grains, dairy, but what about vegetables? Vikings definitely ate their veggies, but their options were limited to what could grow in that harsh Scandinavian climate. Root vegetables were essential. Turnips, carrots, onions, and parsnips could survive the cold and be stored through winter. They grew cabbages, kale, and peas. Leeks and garlic added flavor to their stews and porridges. Beans were common too. They provided protein and could be dried and stored. But here's what's really cool. Vikings were expert foragers. They gather wild mushrooms, herbs, berries, nuts, and edible plants from the forests and fields. Berries were huge. Lingonberries, blueberries, cloudberries, wild strawberries. They'd eat them fresh in summer and preserve them for winter by drying them or making them into preserves with honey. Nuts like hazelnuts and walnuts provided fat and protein. Herbs weren't just for flavor, they were medicine too. Thyme, mint, parsley, dill, horseradish, mustard seeds. Vikings understood that these plants could help with digestion, preservation, and healing. And here's something that might surprise you: seaweed. Vikings absolutely used seaweed, both as food and as fertilizer for their fields, high in nutrients and literally free for the taking. Apples were the main fruit crop, and they'd preserve them through winter, or make them into cider. They also gathered wild apples and crab apples. The Viking diet was way more plant-based than you'd think from watching TV shows.
All right, let's talk about what Vikings drank, because this is where things get fun. Mead is what everyone thinks of, that honey wine that shows up in every Viking movie. And yes, it was real, and yes, Vikings did drink it. But here's the thing. Honey was expensive. Mead was a luxury drink, reserved for celebrations, ceremonies, and showing off your wealth. What did Vikings drink on a daily basis? Ale. Beer made from barley, sometimes flavored with herbs before hops became standard. And I'm not talking about a light lager here. This was thick, nutritious, low-alcohol ale that was safer to drink than water and provided calories. Milk and buttermilk were everyday drinks. They drink it fresh, fermented, or mixed with water. Water too, of course, though fermented beverages were often preferred because the fermentation process made them safer. Wine was imported and crazy expensive, only for the wealthy, and usually something you'd encounter if you were trading or raiding in Europe. Now, feasting, this is where Vikings really went all out. Feasts were social events, political events, religious ceremonies all rolled into one. When Vikings feasted, they feasted. Imagine a long hall, fire pits burning, everyone gathered on benches along long tables, roasted meats, whole pigs, sides of beef, haunches of venison, bread, cheese, butter, stews bubbling in cauldrons, horns of ale being passed around, musicians playing, stories being told. This is where meat consumption spiked. Festivals, weddings, religious celebrations, victory celebrations. This is what shaped the Viking reputation as meat eaters, but it wasn't how they ate every Tuesday. So, what did a typical day of eating look like for a Viking? Vikings usually ate 2 main meals a day. Dagmal, the day meal, happened in the morning, usually a few hours after waking and starting work. This was often porridge, maybe some bread, cheese, and dried or smoked fish. Practical, filling, fuel for the day's work. Nattmal, the night meal, was the main meal, eaten in the evening after the day's work was done. This is when families gathered. You might have a stew made with whatever meat, fish, or vegetables were available, more bread, more dairy, maybe some ale. Cooking methods were pretty straightforward, but required skill. Open fires were the main heat source. They'd roast meat on spits, bake bread in clay ovens or under ash, and simmer stews in large iron cauldrons or soapstone pots. Smoking and curing preserved meat and fish. Smokehouses were common, where you'd hang meat and fish above smoldering fires for days. Fermentation was used for everything: preserving vegetables, making drinks, processing dairy, storing fish. Vikings understood that controlled fermentation made food last longer and sometimes made it more digestible. Salting was another crucial preservation technique, especially for fish and meat. Cooking was typically done by the women of the household, though on ships or during military campaigns, men did their own cooking. It was communal, often with everyone contributing to food preparation. Food wasn't just about nutrition, it was about community, sharing, and survival through those brutal Scandinavian winters. Here's something important. Not all Vikings ate the same way. If you were wealthy, a jarro, a successful trader, a landowner with thralls working your farm, you ate better and more often. More meat, more variety, access to imported goods like spices, wine, exotic fruits. You could host impressive feasts that reinforced your social status. If you were a farmer or a common worker, your diet was simpler, more repetitive, but still nutritious. Lots of porridge, dairy, bread, preserved fish, seasonal vegetables, meat when you could afford it. If you were a thrall, essentially a slave, you ate the simplest food, whatever was cheapest and most available. Enough to keep you working, but nothing fancy. Food was status. Being able to serve meat at a feast, having imported wine, owning enough livestock to slaughter animals for celebrations. These things demonstrated wealth and power. Even the quality of your bread mattered. Fine wheat bread versus coarse barley bread could signal your social position. But here's what's interesting. Even wealthy Vikings ate relatively simple food by modern standards. There were no elaborate sauces, no refined sugar, no complex cooking techniques. The food was straightforward, seasonal, and focused on preserving what nature provided.
So there you have it, what Vikings really ate. They weren't just carnivorous raiders living on meat and mead. They were sophisticated farmers and food preservers who created a diet that could sustain them through Arctic winters. They ate seasonally, used every part of the animals they raised, foraged from the land, and became masters of fermentation and preservation. Their diet was high in protein, rich in dairy, full of whole grains, and supplemented with whatever vegetables, berries, and herbs they could grow or gather. It was honestly pretty healthy, especially compared to the processed foods we eat today. The next time you eat that trendy skyr yogurt or have some gravlax at brunch, remember, Vikings were doing this 1,000 years ago, not because it was trendy, but because it kept them alive, thriving, and ready to explore the world from North America to the Mediterranean. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.